Welcome to Can Africa Be Part of the Solution to America's Critical Mineral Supply Chain? Please welcome Josh Meservey, Research Fellow for Africa in the Heritage Foundation's Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our online audience. We have about 200 people tuning in from all over the world, so a lot of interest in the topic, and really excited because we've put together a great panel on an important topic at a critical moment, I would say. So my name is Joshua Meservey. I handle the Africa portfolio here at the Heritage Foundation. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about critical minerals and the U.S.'s vulnerable supply chains and what role can Africa play in trying to shore up those problems for the U.S. I'm going to go right to our introductions because we only have an hour and there's so much that we could discuss here, and we have so much expertise gathered that I don't want to waste much time. So I'll start with our virtual guest here. This is Mr. Henk de Hoop, who is joining us from London virtually. He is the CEO of SFA Oxford, which is a advisory consultancy firm specializing in platinum group metals, battery metals and materials, and related issues. Henk has almost 3 decades of work in the mining, engineering, and finance industries. He's worked on mergers and acquisitions. He's an expert on the relationship between platinum group metals, mining, and the auto sector, which is a hot topic, of course. And also on battery materials and metals for the hydrogen economy. He was at RMB Bank for about more than 10 years. Before that, he spent 12 years as a mining analyst. And he was also an explosives engineer for several years. So you know who to go to for all your explosives needs. He is a graduate of the University of Delft in the Netherlands. So welcome, Henk. To my right here is Mr. Pierre Leon. He is the global chair of Herbert Smith Freehills Africa Group. He is one of the world's preeminent mining lawyers. He has particular expertise on Africa and on issues such as resource nationalism, mineral and petroleum regulations in developing countries, and international investment law, among others. He's practiced on the continent for decades and beyond the continent. He is a senior scholar of Christ College, Cambridge. He's a council member of the International Bar Association and a graduate of the University of Cambridge and the University of Cape Town in South Africa, of course. And then last but not least, Dr. J. Peter Pham. He is the Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's a non-executive director of Rainbow Rare Earths and a non-executive director of the AfriCell Group. He most recently was the special envoy for the Sahel, for the U.S. special envoy, which was the inaugural position, first time anyone had held that. He was also special envoy for the Great Lakes region. He's a prolific author, articles, essays, books, and he gave me my first job in Washington, D.C., so if anyone is looking for someone to blame for my career, you can direct your ire towards him. And also, he was recently accepted into the American Academy of Diplomacy, so congratulations. Yeah. I'm going to start with Henk and bring him in for sort of the 1,000-foot view of this issue, and hoping, Henk, that you can walk us through a Critical Minerals 101, briefly, of course. So what are they? Why are they critical? And what is the market for them now, and what's the forecast look like? Why do we expect these minerals to not only continue to be important, but actually to increase in importance? And then finally, where does China fit into this into the critical minerals landscape?
Sure, thanks, Joshua, and thanks everyone online. Maybe let's start with a bit of a definition, and there's a range of definitions, but I thought the one that is fairly simple to understand is any substance used in technology that is subject to supply risks and for which there are no easy substitutes. Now, if you look at the list of critical materials defined by different governments, they can be different for different regions, because what for the one country is critical because they don't have any of it is not as critical for others. So the European list is quite different from the US list. But if one looks at why this subject has, I guess, over the last 18 months, 2 years, become even more important than what it always has been. But if one looks at the amount of detail that is being provided by the different regions, how it has crept up in the debates as in a matter of importance, is for essentially, I guess, three main reasons. First, the emergence of electric vehicles and the need to make massive transformations in what for most countries are very important industries. It's not just putting the cars together, but there's a very large supplier base attached to it. It is a real revolution if you look at what it requires from a sourcing of materials to put these cars together from what it historically was and what it is going to be going forward. There are certain commodities in there that are being ramped up in volumes that the world probably has never seen, an acceleration in demand of these metals that used to be going much more at a GDP rate, that because of the changing technology is ramping up and required to ramp up at a hectic pace. And we're talking particularly lithium, cobalt, nickel, of course. The other reason why this has become such an important subject is the Ukrainian conflict. There is a really important drive coming through now where the Ukrainian conflict, the energy security as a result of it, some of the metal security, because Russia is an important producer of certain critical materials, combined with the attitude that China is taking in the world, has forced all the large regions to focus on our supply chains. The last 2-3 years, COVID in the background, big disruptions in container traffic, big disruptions in getting goods to plants. There's a big chip crisis that has really choked the car industry. There's a lot of reasons why corporates and countries have started to think differently on how we source our material. It is not a global world anymore as much as it was probably 5 years ago. People are starting to think if we want to really build these industries, we better make sure we have access to these metals. Now, there's another reason why critical materials have also ramped up on the agenda. There are certain countries that have started to become very, very dominant, and particularly China is obviously one of those, where if one looks at the percentage control they have, and with the attitude, I guess, of China becoming less integrated rather than more integrated, it does impose a lot of risk if you want to build out your own industries, and a lot of that metal will have to come from, well, I guess a lesser friendly country than what it was in the past. Rare earth is obviously the main example. We're talking control of over 90% of the world's supply of these, and where rare earths are particularly becoming linked to these new developments is in magnets and in the car industries, the windmills and so forth. If you go back a bit further in time when solar was becoming a big theme, China was ahead of the rest of the world in ramping up their solar capacity, and in fact became so successful and scaled up in it that it killed the industries in a lot of other regions. They could not survive based on the essential success of China ramping up solar to that extent that solar became eventually very cheap as well. And it pushed a lot of the emerging solar industries and the rest of the world out of business. Now, something similar is starting to happen in the battery electric vehicle side, for example, where a lot of the critical material debates are focused at the moment, because that's where there's a massive amount of capital going at the moment. The cumulative capital committed to the BEV transition by car companies around the world is $1.2 trillion up till 2030. Now, you can imagine that type of investment is going to really change the landscape. And again, China was very much ahead of everyone else. They built the lithium supply chains, particularly the lithium processing chains, locking in supplies from the Australian suppliers, from the South American suppliers. And there's a risk again that they are building up the scale ahead of anyone else, which will make it very difficult to compete in that area. The first Chinese cars are starting to arrive in Europe, and they're very, very competitively priced because it's the one manufacturer that makes their own batteries and mines their own material and gets it all the way in the chain into the car, and actually becomes very competitively against the established European base that has been trying to change into and revolutionize their production process, but have not been as fast as China in getting that done. Now, US is very much facing a similar dilemma, and basically the Inflation Reduction Act has tried to preempt some of these developments coming through, and trying to insist that quite a few of the materials that one would need to build an electrical vehicle supply chain, for example, have to be sourced either on soil or from friendly countries. And there are big incentives, and subsequent to the act, there have been a whole range of new announcements on battery plants being built in the US, because it has had a very positive effect. Now, if one looks at eventually coming back, then, okay, where does Africa play in this? Now, if you look at the geological distribution of resources, Australia is a mining region, obviously South America is a mining region. In principle, Africa should be a major mining region as well, if you look at what resources they sit on and what could potentially be produced from those resources, because that is an important point to explain as well. Resources are great to have, but if they're in the soil and you make it too difficult, either economically to extract them or physically, where your logistics don't work, you don't have power, you don't have infrastructure, it will not get mined. Now, that is unfortunately the situation in Africa. South Africa was probably and is still the most industrialized country by far in Africa, and has been very successful over 150 years, of mining industry in building out those resources they sit on. It has not only been, a relatively stable environment to build these out, maybe with the exception of the last 20, 30 years, but it was also a very rich geology that they were sitting on. They have the biggest vanadium deposits in the world, the biggest chrome deposits in the world, the biggest manganese deposits in the world, the biggest platinum group metals deposits in the world by far. The biggest gold field that ever existed were in South Africa. But there are other countries in Africa that have very comparable richness, and we're talking particularly Zambia and the DRC, and Peter is going to talk a bit about that later as well. But the Congo, probably, the DRC has some of the absolute richest geology you can find anywhere on Earth. If you dig up a copper mine in South America, you're looking at 0.5% of copper per ton that you would mine in big volumes to make it profitable. In the DRC, Robert Friedland from Ivanhoe is ramping up a mine, which is going to be the third biggest copper mine in the world, which mines 5-6% copper. It is an incredible rich ore body that is available, and a lot of that's still to be discovered. To get that done, though, he needed to really spend many years first discovering it, working with different governments that had different attitudes towards mining as well. But also he had to build up his own power infrastructure, often even building the own border posts, because they weren't set up to handle trucks with concentrate leaving the country, for example. Despite all that, he did manage to pull off an amazing project that has absorbed obviously billions of dollars, but is going to be, for decades to come, one of the most important copper producers in the world. So it can be done, but it's proper pioneering work. And I think where he decided to partner with a Chinese firm, I think if one wants to break through in some of those resources rich countries, it is not an easy task. It's a lot of hard work. It needs a lot of risk capital as well, because there is a cemetery full of failed mining companies in Africa. So it is not for the faint-hearted. But at the same time, if one looks at the ease of doing business increasingly South America is becoming a lot more difficult as well. Government policies are getting nationalistic. So on a relative basis, I think Africa is not necessarily going backwards. It is often that other regions are going backwards, making Africa not look as scary possibly as what it used to be if one compared it to, say, opening up a mine in Australia or opening up a mine in South America. Still, I think if one looks at the ability of Africa to attract investment flows, we've had some very big changes in friendliness or unfriendliness towards mining in foreign investment in Africa. And those shifts in policy, I think, have been very damaging to Africa's image. We have, for example, now a much more mining-friendly government in Zambia. But before that, it was getting increasingly tough to actually justify any investments in Zambia. And it's slowly coming back, that willingness to look and consider countries. And I think a final point to make, and if you want to diversify your supply in critical minerals and you are looking at Africa, it is time intensive. Mining from discovery until all the paperwork is done, and that's often a longer road nowadays because of all the environmental concerns, into actually producing the goods and having the ability to export. We're talking often 10, 15 years. And that is also where the debate in critical materials has become so urgent. The demand side is far easier in sight than the supply side. It takes you 2 years to build a gigafactory, but to find the minerals and supply the minerals to that gigafactory, we're talking often 7 to 10 to 15 years. So there is a mismatch on the speed at which we're moving into certain critical material heavy demand sectors, and the world's ability and Africa's ability to supply those as well. So maybe I'll leave it at that for now, and back to Joshua.
Yeah, thanks, Hank, for that really interesting overview. There's a lot to unpack there. We'll go to Peter Pham next, so Hank sort of gave us the 1,000-foot view, hoping you can take us down to maybe the intermediate view. Describe for us the scale of the U.S.'s critical minerals challenge, if you would. Hank touched on it a little bit, but how bad is it? Is it not so bad? Is it okay? And then could you also describe Chinese companies' activities and presence in the critical minerals industry in Africa? Again, Hank touched on it, but dig a little bit deeper for us. And then maybe a few ideas, right, for what the U.S. can do here.
Sure. That's quite a bit to unpack in 5 minutes. But thank you again, Josh, for organizing this. It's great to be with you and with Peter and with Hank, and thank Hank for setting up the. Since we're talking about risk, I think it might be useful to begin by kind of unpacking a couple of things, a different way of looking at it. The need for the U.S. and indeed for the world for these minerals is burgeoning. Even if it's not reflected in the spot price today on some of these minerals. To give you just 2 data points, in order to achieve the 1.5 degree Celsius global warming, that is the target of various COP meetings, including the COP27 coming up, we're going to have a shortfall of somewhere in the next decade of 9.7 million tons of copper alone, just to achieve that very, very modest goal. It's got to come from somewhere. To speak about the U.S.'s vulnerabilities, cobalt, absolutely essential. We all know about it for electric batteries, all sorts of other applications. Our domestic supply is such, there's a lot in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act about encouraging domestic supply. I'm all for reshoring if the geology permits it. But if we scrape together every last ounce of cobalt that we have in reserves in the United States and maybe do a little bit of recycling, we might just eke by 5 years of demand, and after which we don't have anything left. So this has got to come from somewhere. And this is where I think Africa has a unique role to play. And I would kind of put the role in several different baskets. There are areas where Africa can provide minerals that are needed, that are available elsewhere. Hank talked about increasing political, I would say even the social license to operate in places like South America, Chile. For copper, well, Africa, as he mentioned, Robert Friedland's Ivanhoe mine at Kamwa-Kakula in the Democratic Republic of Congo, within 2 years from now, it's going to be the third largest copper mine in the world, powered by hydro that the company put in, renewable energy, and that's going to be contributing to supply. Copper is found in various places in the world, but Africa certainly will help fill that gap. Otherwise, the gap of investment, 23, 25 billion a year that isn't in the pipeline to meet the goals that the world has said it wants. So that's one way Africa can help. Then there's where geology favors Africa. And there you have to, differently. Cobalt, again, to return to that. Currently, the Democratic Republic of Congo produces roughly 70% of the global production. Then we get into processing. I'll return to that in China, as you asked me to. So that's another area where, slightly differently, it's not fine. You can't find it anywhere. There's pockets elsewhere, but not in the concentration. It's found in Africa. That's critical. Purity of iron. We're going to need, even with today's depressed prices, the global slowdown and all of that, it's expected that the demand for iron to go into steel and other applications is going to grow to roughly about 3 billion tons a year by 2024. Where's that going to come from? Again, Africa presents a solution. There's a lot of iron going on, but Australia, that's been long mined. Guinea, the Nimba Mountains, there are projects there. That mountain is literally a mountain of iron. You're talking about 60 and above grades of ore. So there are opportunities there. And then finally, the final basket, I would say, that we have to kind of divide things in, are truly the rare earths that we talk about. China currently dominates 90% of that supply chain. The only way to de-risk it is to look for alternative sources. Now, full disclosure, I sit on the board of a publicly traded company, Rainbow Rare Earths, that has two sources. One, a mine in Burundi, the other, a project based on phosphogypsum that we've recently published the economic studies on, that potentially over 15 years can produce really $3 billion worth of the stuff in concentrate oxides that are exportable back to the US. The challenge for these resources that come out of Africa is going to be, how do these companies survive that monopoly? And the reason I point that out, if you go to La Rochelle in France, there's a lovely art cooperative that one can visit. What used to be the Rhône-Poulenc, the largest rare earth processing plant in the world in its time. Through a concerted price war, they were driven out of business entirely by Chinese competition, to the point where today you have a lovely art studio, but no rare earths being processed there. And that, I think, is the lesson that if we want to secure our supply chain, we need to also talk about offtake and other things. Now, one last comment on the operations. It's not just that China controls the processing, but it also has acquired, over a number of years, assets in Africa, mining assets. In the DRC, control virtually almost all of the cobalt mine facilities. However, it's also locked in a significant fight with the government of the DRC, which is asking legitimate questions like, this was a deal that was made under the former regime, supposedly for $6.8 billion of infrastructure in exchange for $6 billion worth of minerals. Heaven knows how much minerals were taken out, but no one can point to $6.8 billion worth of infrastructure anywhere in the country. In fact, the only piece of infrastructure anyone can point to is the one hotel that everyone stays at when they go to Kinshasa. It's a very lovely hotel. I wouldn't have very many conversations in the hotel, but but it's a lovely little hotel. But it's certainly not a $1 billion, much less a $6.8 billion hotel. So that's an area where, again, the United States, there are instruments that we have to help either with anti-corruption investigations, examination of contracts, forensic audits, and then, more importantly, on the positive side, the authorities given within the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and other instruments to assist with in taking equity as well as credit to operations that serve the national interest. So we need to look more seriously at that. There's been some modest steps for DFC money being indirectly invested in the mining sector through TechMet, but that certainly there's a lot more that could be done there. And that serves, again, to secure a supply chain.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many interesting avenues we could go down there from your comments. I'm struck by how metals intensive renewable energy sources are. EVs require something like, depending on the mineral, like 3 to 7 times the amount of minerals that a normal car does. Wind turbines, solar panels, these are all incredibly metals intensive. And you touched on it, Hank touched on it. The capacity just isn't there right now. And mining is such a long-term project, very difficult. Again, Hank talked about this, that it's really hard to see, how we're going to get to these targets. But again, I do want to bring in Peter here because, you've worked all over the continent and beyond, but you have a special expertise and experience with a country that's come up already a bunch of times, and that's the DRC. DRC, Hank said this, arguably the richest deposit of minerals in the world. We're probably not even sure all that it contains because geological surveys and mapping of the entire continent are very patchy indeed. And DRC and Zambia are both really interesting. Another country that you've done a lot of work on are both really interesting case studies because of the Chinese presence, especially. Dr. Pham referenced it. Similar story in Zambia. They've had successes, obviously, Chinese companies in these countries, but they've also had problems. So I was hoping that you could do a couple things for us. Sort of give us an analysis of the Chinese presence in these countries and how did this come to be? It's a somewhat recent phenomenon over the last couple decades. So if you could sort of walk us through that. And then, what lessons are there for the United States, given China's experience in these countries, its successes, its failures, and particularly because the a U.S. company used to have a presence in DRC, right? Famously, Freeport-McMoRan, very wealthy, had a very rich mine, and now a Chinese company has that mine. So, again, 5 to 7 minutes, lots to unpack there.
Yeah. Well, Josh, thank you very much for having me. Great to be here this morning or this afternoon, wherever people are listening. There's a big difference between the DRC and Zambia. Obviously, share the copper belt, Hank's already mentioned the fact that the copper belt is one of the richest geological areas in the world for copper and cobalt. Even though in terms of copper, compared with Latin America, it's relatively small fry, but it has about 30% of the world's cobalt reserves. So, and 10% of copper. So it is very significant, but it's the richness of the resources that is so critical. But there's a big difference between the two in this sense from a Chinese angle. Because if you look at China's role in the DRC compared with its role in Zambia, it's been a slightly different approach. In the DRC, to my mind, and you referred to the CMOC acquisition of the Freeport assets, the Tenke mine in the DRC in 2016, but that was preceded by deals that go back many years when Nixon was in office here, when those mines were originally acquired by U.S. investors. And you've seen over the years a progression of sales to Chinese companies such that the Chinese now own, I think, something in the region of 15 out of 19 cobalt assets in the DRC. So their focus in the DRC has clearly been on cobalt. And I think, with all due respect, the U.S. has been rather asleep at the wheel in letting this happen because it's been a slow process. And very recently, CMOC acquired the Kasanfu asset in the DRC from Freeport. So there, I think the Chinese approach has been extremely strategic to secure these cobalt resources, which are incredibly rich in material. In Zambia, it's been, and there have been issues, and Peter's referred to them. There have been issues between Gécamines and CMOC in the DRC, which looked as though it was going to get very messy, and it's finally been resolved. But MMG, another Chinese company in the DRC, is threatening international arbitration against Gécamines and the DRC government over a dispute over its mine. As I say, the CMOC issue has been resolved, but in the Zambia, it's been a different issue. We actually look at Zambia, there is, from a Chinese perspective, very little investment in mining as opposed to Chinese loans for infrastructure. So in Zambia, you've really had what I would call debt trap diplomacy at work by the Chinese lenders, many of which are state-backed or state-owned. And as you know, Zambia was one of the first countries in the world during COVID to go into the government defaulted on its bonds. It's unclear what the extent of Chinese lending in Zambia is. It's anywhere between $6 and $9 billion, and China has come along with the Paris Club on the creditors committee in terms of resolving the debt issues in Zambia. But the Chinese interest in Zambia has really been around infrastructure, loans for infrastructure, and certainly the criticism has been that when the Patriotic Front under Edgar Lungu was in office, and fortunately he went out of office last year, and you now have a much more liberal, democratic, economically sensible administration under President Hichilema, which is much more mining friendly. All the issues with the mining industry in Zambia, and I worked on one of them for Vedanta, were, that was an Indian company. Glencore were there with the Mopani mine. That's obviously a Swiss company. Issues between the Copperfield Energy Corporation and ZESCO, that didn't have any real Chinese influence. So the issues in Zambia have been much more about Chinese lending, and some would say the allegation is predatory lending to Zambia, and the allegation, I'm not saying it's correct or not, is that some of those loans were benefited the elite in the then ruling party, because if you look at the Kenneth Kaunda terminal at Lusaka International Airport, the project cost something in the region of $300 million. A lot of people think it should have cost $150 million. The question is, why did it cost that amount of money, and where did the money go? So those are the concerns around Zambia, and I think the Chinese influence from a mining perspective in Zambia has been relatively low. The Chinese, on the other hand, have got much more involved in Zimbabwe. They've recently acquired a lithium mine there, and obviously Zimbabwe, despite all its political problems, has the biggest lithium deposits in Africa, and is potentially the biggest lithium producer in Africa. And obviously lithium is a key ingredient for the green energy transition, just as cathodes and cobalt are a key element for the green energy transition from the DRC perspective. So I've answered your question a long way around, but the one thing I would say about the DRC is everybody wants to get there. I mean, who's prepared to take the risk? And Henk has referred to Robert Friedland's huge investment in the copper and cobalt mine. I mean, he's saying, and maybe we can talk about this in the discussion, Henk, he's saying that it's less risky to invest in the DRC than it is in Chile under the current left-wing administration in Chile. Except I would say to that obviously the changes to the Chilean constitution were rejected in the recent referendum, and the government appears to be less messianic about tearing up the Pinochet-era consensus around mining than they were before the election. So one has to see what will happen in practice. But certainly it's very interesting how all these full circles develop, because 10 years ago, Africa was really the center of resource nationalism, and I've done a lot of work around that in Tanzania and Zambia and places like that. And Latin America wasn't, but what you're seeing now is the reverse of that, because Latin America, if you look at Chile and Peru, which are the two biggest copper producers, is becoming much more resource nationalistic than many countries in Africa. Obviously, and Henk's referred to this, South Africa is a bit of an outlier there because the government is still very ideological about mining, which has had a very negative impact on investment in the South African mining sector. But if you look at coming back to Zambia, I mean, the Hichilema administration has said it wants to look at the whole issue of mining royalties. They have now made mining royalties tax deductible, which was not the case under the Lungu administration. The government's now looking at amending the Mines and Minerals Act, the mining code in Zambia, to make it more investor-friendly. One has to see what will happen in the DRC, because there's an election next year. Obviously, Tshisekedi's preparing to run again. And there have been all these fights between Gécamines, because what normally happens, Gécamines is a state-owned miner, and normally it will have a 20% free carry in any new mining operations, which is by law that it's given. And it's had, as you've indicated, and Henk and Peter referred to this, all these disputes with the other mining companies in the DRC. So that's a bit of a cook's tour, and I'm happy to talk about it some more in the questions.
Yeah, I have just quick questions for each of you, and I'll stay with you maybe on the DRC issue especially, but also I guess across the continent. So regulatory environments really vary on the continent, of course, but the regulatory risk and the political risk for a lot of mining companies does seem quite high on the continent. Can you give us your sense, and you talked a little bit about how Africa is moving a bit away from the resource nationalism. Do you think that's a sustaining trend? Like, is that a trend that's going to continue? Is this a blip? What's your sense of what the sort of the regulatory environment, and I know it varies widely,
yeah.
but
look, it depends. I mean, I spent 3 years working in Tanzania on the crisis that President Magufuli created for Acacia and many of the mining companies there. As you know, he's since passed on, and President Hassan, his successor, even though she comes from the CCM, is much more economically liberal and moderate. And she's determined, for example, to get the offshore gas industry off the ground, and that's a key deliverable for her. And certainly there's been some slight pushback from some of the sort of very resource nationalistic measures that the Magufuli administration took in Tanzania in 2017. But it's very difficult to say because, I mean, every country differs. But certainly what I saw in Tanzania in 2017 was then followed by what the Lungu administration did in Zambia to Vedanta and to Glencore in 2019. So, I mean, that sort of pattern of resource nationalism in East Africa sort of spread to Central Africa. I mean, the one outlier, and it's interesting, my friend Tony Carroll is in the audience, is Botswana, because it always gets the top marks in Africa for having on the Fraser Institute survey, having the best, most investor-friendly mining regime, and it combines that with an independent, competent, technocratic civil service, which many African countries simply don't have. So Botswana is always the outlier. It always gets the top ranks on the Fraser Institute survey. I mean, countries like Ghana, which have been relatively good, have slipped in recent times, despite the fact that it has a reasonably good mining code and a nominally independent minerals commission. So I think it really depends where you go. But I have the sense that African mining regimes are becoming a bit more pragmatic than they were, and less ideological than they were in the past.
Well, that's good news. I wanted to swing to you, Dr. Pham, and maybe you want to chime in there, but so please do. But I also wanted to layer on another question for you. You've talked a little bit about friend sourcing. I've heard you talk about that previously. Can you sort of describe that a little bit for us and how you think maybe that can be part of the solution for the United States? And then, I think you wanted to jump in on Peter's comment.
Yeah, no, certainly. And just to two fingers on what Peter has said, I agree with what's been said there. But I do think we need to approach this with two things in mind. One is a bit of realism, both about what we can do here in the United States and what can be done there. And secondly, keeping an eye on what is our strategic objective as the United States. The strategic objective at the end of the day is de-risking our supply chains to these critical minerals. That's the objective at the end of the day. And how do we best do it? And this is where I may engage in what to my fellow conservatives or libertarians may seem like a bit of heresy, but willing to take that in order to achieve the strategic objective, which is we can use a little bit of that resource nationalism and some of the sentiments. At the end of the day, as much as we'd like an easier, realistic, practical licensing and permitting regime in our own country, we all know that Americans suffer from a horrible disease of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Getting processing done for a lot of these minerals in the United States, good luck. Whereas the regime is a little less severe in places like Africa. Yet they don't capture the value of their own resources. I mean, to me, one of the most ironic stories in the world is in the name of the energy transition of a greener economy, you're going to mine or gather cobalt in the DRC, put it on diesel trucks, send it 1,000 miles to the Indian Ocean, burning how much carbon in the process, put it on a boat, which will consume more fossil fuels all the way to China, and heaven knows how it's processed there, all in the name of getting greener. That's an absurdity, an absurd story. Now, if processing were done locally, and this is where a little bit of African nationalism, I think, dovetails with U.S. interests. If it was done locally, it would certainly would save all the carbon that was spewed out getting it to China. It would allow Africans to capture more of the value chain. And thirdly, in the long run, it's highly unlikely geopolitically that any African country, the DRC or any others, is going to hold up access, American, as long as we're willing to pay whatever the market price is, hold up access to process minerals over, say, a maritime dispute or a freedom of navigation exercise. So we de-risk it, our supply chains, by at the same time helping build up the value which Africans want to keep talking about. So it becomes the true win-win in this whole equation. So I would advocate for thinking a little outside of our normal boxes and perhaps embracing solutions that, in appearance might not be ideologically pure, but achieve the strategic objective at the end, which is critically de-risking these supply chains for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Henk, I want to bring you back in just quickly, and then we need to get to some questions and discussion. We've talked about this, and you did as well, this surge in projected demand for these minerals. Africa is a major source of these minerals. Other places that have them are difficult for a whole host of reasons, with some exceptions like Australia, but Russia and China are major, hold major reserves of some of these minerals. Why aren't American companies more involved in the African mining space? We've already talked about Freeport-McMoRan a little bit and how they did withdraw from DRC, which again is one of the richest deposits in all the world. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Josh. I think the big question is, at the end of the day, money is looking for the balance of risk and return. And I think there have been a couple of great successes, but if one looks at the amount of companies that have given it a shot and have tried, there's been a lot of failures along the way as well. And I think if one looks at efforts spent on, say, exploration in Australia and converting that into a, let's call it a 10-bagger, and having tried the same in South America, having tried the same in Africa, Africa probably has a fairly poor track record in actually the conversion of risk money into the returns that a shareholder, that type of shareholder would look for. I've spent 30 years in South Africa, and we've seen a very, very clear almost collapse of foreign interest as the result of poor policy. If there is a denial of called economic returns or exit returns based on the risk taken, eventually that money will go somewhere else. And I think, and Peter already touched on that, we've had some very inconsistent election by election changes in investor friendliness and investor unfriendliness. And I think if you look at a long-term curve of Zambian copper supply as a country, it is very, very clear how when Zambia became independent and ended up nationalizing the industry, the copper industry completely collapsed. And it was only rock bottom when it was hardly producing copper anymore. It started to open up to outside companies and outside capital. It started bringing back some of that volume. And again, there have been changes in government and government's attitude to private investment that have stalled that again. And it's that type of risk of committing long-term capital and eventually not getting the return that you're seeking. Eventually people will give up. And I think it's not even US specific. I think it's not that either European capital or Australian capital was much more successful. Africa has unfortunately not been that friendly to long-term capital gaining the returns that it needs. It's also then one of the, I guess, benefits that you have if you have a geology that is extremely rich, like the Congo. What you do get is when you get through all the hard fights and get a mine up and going, your payback is often not 10 years. It's often 2 or 3 years in extreme cases because the grades are so good. And that's why it is not often called the easiest country that attracts the capital. It's also depending on your geological heritage, what will eventually see you attracting money. If you can come in, make sure your payback is 2 or 3 years, and after that it's only upside. The DRC has managed to actually attract certain amounts of capital and been successful in that, but it has been very, very tough going. I think from a history of attracting foreign capital, and again, a bit with, I guess, South African glasses, South Africa has been phenomenally effective over many years, decades, to attract and build the mining industry. And it's only when the policy started to become investor unfriendly that it has stalled and is now starting to decline. And for a range of other reasons, including access to infrastructure, poor power issues, and community issues with big expectations around your mines. I think at the end of the day, if you do design policies, you have the right geology, I think you'll re-attract, and the American investment public will re-look at Africa. And I think we are getting close to a moment again where, first of all, the need of critical materials is evident, and building supply chains that are moving away from what could be seen as called unfriendly regions or clear unfriendly regions. There is an opportunity for Africa to advertise itself again. I think the past called fears, and I've looked at one of the questions there on called the extraction model of the past. I think one of the positive co-developments is that any mining company in the world that wants to attract either investor money or wants to get into a country or into a region, it better have its ESG story right and better have the credentials ready to show that they're not coming in there to, or the old rape and pillage attitude of mining and going. There's not a shareholder nowadays in many of the called financial capitals of the world that doesn't start a conversation with the CEO of, Tell me about your ESG. What are you doing there? What are you doing on your social area? How does your environmental track record look? And how do you intend to actually, when going into the region, make sure that my money has called a governance overlay and a social overlay that I can justify to my investors again. So my sense is there's definitely call it the time opening up where the need for the minerals are there. The governments are starting to wake up, and I think there's it's still a long slog, but there and particularly I think there's pretty much unfair blaming of the mining companies of all the troubles around mines. The mining companies that we work with, the CEOs we talk with, they are incredibly committed to getting their ESG right, and they are very much using that throughout the organizational culture to make sure that where they operate, they build the relationships and they are a force for good. So I'm quite confident that there is a time coming now where this return of capital into Africa is going to accelerate, and I think there's the evidence of African leadership seeing what the benefits mining can do is going to emerge as well, and that is also a big opportunity for U.S. capital to relook at that relationship and relook at the opportunities in Africa.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to move to Q&A here. And I just wanted to note, of course, I will say, Chinese companies, as much as it pains me to admit this, they have stayed the course, and now they are reaping the benefits. And that's a reality that the U.S. has to face head on. So Tony, if you got a mic right behind you, just identify yourself quickly. And
Hi, Tony Carroll. Thank you very much for an excellent panel, and I'll be very brief. Hank, maybe this is pointed to you. Just a comment. One of the reasons the U.S. hasn't been particularly active in mining is partly because we don't really have the capital market structure that provides the financing vehicles that really allow and energize, particularly junior mining. That tends to be Australia, Canada, South Africa, the London Exchange. So we've really, in effect, over-regulated and in effect, driven out the junior miners in the United States, access to capital. As a securities lawyer in Denver in the 1970s and 80s, I saw that firsthand. Secondly, and Rome Plank was a client of mine, so I can speak about the decline of a world-class company because of Chinese competition. Hank, I could go on, but the only question I really have for you is, Africa is on the verge of this African-Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is going to maybe solve some of the problems that you noted in terms of supply chain. The rub will be, Peter, in your model is that I might be willing to invest in a processing plant in Kenya or Botswana, but I'm not going to probably want to invest in a processing plant in Burundi. And the reasons is the risk profiles in Botswana and Kenya, and let alone the infrastructure, power supply, technical competence, human capacity, institutional structure, professional environment, and so forth, are much more conducive to an investment in processing. I guess the challenge will be in African nationalism whether or not the Burundians will complain about a processing plant being built in Kenya or South Africa or Botswana where the risk profiles are less, or will that happen because of the idea of building supply chains intra-Africa will mean that they'll be willing to surrender some of those restrictions on resource nationalism at a national level?
yeah, Hank, do you want to weigh in?
Sorry, was the question addressed to me or to Peter?
To you initially, I think, but yeah. So why don't you start us off?
Okay, I'll try to answer because it was quite a broad set of issues you've touched on there. Firstly, capital markets structured to actually source the capital for the type of risk you're taking on in mining. Absolutely, there's let's call it horses for courses. There's a distinct benefit that the Canadian capital markets have over many other markets, for example, and that's why you'll see them appearing in Africa relative to the US companies. I agree. From an attractiveness of putting downstream facilities and stimulating downstream manufacturing or upgrading of their raw materials, distinct differences in how that gets approached by the different countries as well, and your willingness to commit. I think